All right, so we're talking chapter 9, metaprogramming of Ruby under a microscope. So, as Craig and I were both mentioning, the first part was mostly like we were there, and then the second part we kind of just skimmed or maybe even lost it altogether. So, how did you do, Steve?
Yeah, I felt similarly. I think it's just like not really being exposed to metaprogramming as much because I mean you don't run into it that often, and usually like the only time it's mentioned is just don't do metaprogramming.
Don't do it.
Yeah.
Nice. Oh
So yeah,
man.
that made it a little difficult to follow towards that second half, I suppose.
So I tried to write down a summary when I was done reading this chapter.
Okay.
And
Nice.
The quick bullets I got from that was this chapter was all about different ways you can scope methods, right? And the different ways that you could scope them, but also determine what you have access to. Hey, we have a new one. Hey, Simon. I was just in the middle of giving my summary of what I thought of the chapter. So scoping methods, determining what you would have access to. And I walked away from it thinking, why would you want to do any of this? To be honest. I mean, if you're already in the code, why would you need this? Some of these things just seem super hacky to me. So why wouldn't you just do it the right way instead of the meta program? I could see why in other languages where you may be linking to a library that you don't have access to and you need to overload a method or do something different, you can, but it just doesn't make sense to me to do this in Ruby. And maybe I'm missing something entirely because I don't spend that much time in code. So I don't know, you guys that write much more code than I do, why would you use any of this metaprogramming?
From my experience, I think Rails does a lot of this under the hood. So trying to think if it's like active record or if it's like all of the like hooks and callbacks and things like that. Like they do a lot of metaprogramming where they kind of outline at a high level like what, maybe what the callback does, and then they define a whole bunch of them, and that automatically creates methods for you to call. And I don't know if there's an advantage to doing the metaprogramming route versus doing something like a method missing and then looking it up on the fly. I'm sure that maybe there's just one upfront cost when you do the metaprogramming that generates itself, and then thereafter you have it, versus like a method missing, you're probably constantly doing that work each time. So.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, where Rails in particular does have a fair amount of metaprogramming under the hood. Like the one that I think about is attribute accessor and attribute reader. I believe those use metaprogramming to dynamically create the setter and getter methods. Well, actually, those are written in C now, aren't they?
But I think the class like ones, though, there's a class, something like attribute accessible or something like that for the class level.
Yeah. But yeah, there's things like that, or the way that the conventions of model naming and knowing what files are going to be connected to what and what controllers are connected to what views, that all uses some metaprogramming under the hood. So I think the idea is that you have this possibly confusing metaprogramming happening, but if it's robust and it creates a convention that everyone follows, it can allow for an easier time for your everyday programming, which is when we're actually
for the user
using
of Rails. Yeah, that's a good part. That you want the gross code to go somewhere, and then you get to have a better time. That's just the reality of anything that's good. Doesn't have to be gross, but complex.
Yeah, I've never run into some like a feature or anything where I've thought like, oh, I think this would be a good case for metaprogramming. Or even if I did, it's like I was wrong.
That's funny.
One of the things that stuck out to me was, I think I mentioned, I don't know, 1 or 2 times ago, comparing some of these things to ideas in JavaScript. And I thought it was interesting how all of this deals with passing around the lexical scopes. There was mention of using binding.
Binding,
and
yeah.
This, like, it instantly reminded me of JavaScript. You use bind a lot, and you pass around this keyword in JavaScript, which is this, like, kind of seems like the same thing as passing around the scope. It's just much more explicit. Whereas in Ruby, you don't think in that same way most of the time.
It's getting more implicit in JavaScript with the, was it the rocket
Arrow
style
functions.
function? Yeah, arrow functions. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Which is generating probably a whole new era of bugs, but yeah.
Yep. I didn't really understand refine and using in terms of when you'd actually do that.
Refine is like overriding a method, right?
Yeah, but why would you not just use regular inheritance? And
I don't know.
yeah.
Like I said earlier, I don't know why we do any of this stuff, but
yeah, no, some parts like binding and other stuff like that was why, because refine was starting to lose me, and I was just thinking exactly that. I was like, this is interesting, but where's the Simon value here? And then got up to bind, and that felt more familiar just because I had some context of when you would do stuff with that. Just like changing the object that you're running stuff on. I thought that makes some sense, but I didn't really know the use case for using refine and using.
So I was interested in that because in some of our R specs with the parameterized R specs,
then we do use using.
There's a table syntax and we use it there, but I had no idea that was overriding anything. I thought it was just like adding in some extra stuff in there. But I guess, let me think. Technically, I guess you're overriding maybe the pipe. I don't know what you're overriding in that case.
Yeah, I thought either the pipe or like the array syntax for that, or with them. Is that something usually?
I don't think when or with them are usually part of RSpec or Ruby. So
that I can think of. That is interesting. I hadn't thought of that. I use syntax all the time, and it's just very like, this is part of RSpec. But
so I was like, is that actually a refinement, or is there something else going on? Like, does RSpec have its own thing similar, just with the same keyword? I don't know. I was really curious about that.
I do really love that table syntax thing.
Yeah.
Doing that yesterday, it's beautiful.
Because the other part about refinements, at least for Ruby 2.0, and I'm a little bit past that, but they were saying it has to be done at the main level, right? The top level scope. And that certainly isn't the case for those parameterized RSpec ones. So I don't.
It's scoped to the module, right?
It's like inside of a. I mean, I put it inside a specific context block, or even in a context or a describe block.
And it is just limited to that context.
And it's limited to just that context. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I guess they did.
Or refinements now allows you to call them at other scopes. I don't know. Yeah. But it also got me thinking about like our CE versus EE, and like, would this be applicable to that? Would that work that way? Or not? Because when we like override some, models, for example, like I can think of like the GitLab subscription one is pretty useless in CE because it doesn't do anything. But in EE, it suddenly has all of these methods that do things because you actually have plans and subscriptions. So it's like, is refinements another way to achieve that? Or would it mess things up more than it would help? I don't know. I think it gets back to Craig's question. Like, I need more information about when and why would you use this? Yeah. I need some examples of when it's really useful.
All right, I found it in the RSpec parameterized code. It adds table syntax implement to object and all the basic types.
Nice. So it is a refinement.
Yeah.
Huh.
because the GitLab code base didn't have any usages of refine that I found.
Yeah. I wonder if it's one of those things that we're like, don't use it, kind of like with metaprogramming in general. It's like,
Yeah,
Yeah, like you have to.
in
be
your
very-
product, don't use it.
yeah.
You have to have a very
You
good
2 months
reason
from
to
now will
use
be
it.
angry.
Someone in the other meeting found one example. If you look at their metaprogramming chapter, yeah, Steve's clicking on the link there. Oh, now it says it does not exist.
Yeah.
They took it out.
Yeah, they realized that was a bad idea and redacted it.
Updated committers, I made a terrible mistake.
I regret everything. Huh. Monkey patching using refinements. I'll have to look at that presentation, or whatever this article is about. That looks interesting. Yeah, so I had some questions about that because like earlier in the book when they sort of introduced this concept of refinements, I was like, ooh, like a new thing in Ruby that I'm not aware of. Like, what does this do? And now that we're here, I'm like, I still don't know. What does this do? I think there's more to it that you're not telling me about. But yeah. I was also really curious about the concept of the what they call it, the singleton class. So if you have an object, you're saying like def object dot method, and it creates the singleton class on the fly to put that method definition into. I was like, can you then say object dot singleton class and get that newly created class, or does it still go to some other class? And I didn't have time to try it out, so I'm just going to sit here and muse about it in my mind.
I'm trying to remember how they, because it points to a R class, which I think we learned earlier is just another, like even though it points to its, you know, like a new singleton class, it's just another of the same pattern that we've seen in previous chapters when we looked at classes and objects.
Mm.
So it's, yeah, I don't know how, if you could access that way, but.
What do they call their thing? Some quote. No, I can't find it. Yeah, some quote. Could have guessed that. Some quote dots. Or sorry. I had another question about like the refinements, which I think I just need to read a more in-depth article about refinements. But they were talking about how every time you add a method to sort of the refine block, it tracks that with the actual class and then updates the type to be via method type refined or whatever, so that it knows later like, hey, this method might be refined. I'm just wondering like what happens if you try to refine a method that doesn't exist yet? Like, does it blow up? Does it just make a new method? Like, how is it different from including a module? I guess that's kind of where I'm at with that.
Excellent question.
Yeah, that's where the confusion sets in.
Yeah, I was like, wait, it's a module already, but then it just says refine. And then instead of including the module, we said using this, and then suddenly it does the same thing. Like, what? Why? It's just Craig's everlasting question. Why?
I think probably the more advanced developer you are, and no insult intended to anybody on this call or watching this, but you'll probably go, oh yeah, I can use something in metaprogramming to solve this problem more quickly than restructuring the code the way I want it. So maybe that's it. But right now, I don't know why I would use any of this stuff.
Actually, now that you say that, I'm thinking about it in terms of if it's something you want to change that's outside of your domain. So
Yeah.
you're using a gem and they have a method that has some bug in it or something, and you don't want to go fork it, make your own version, pull it in that, whatever. You just say, I'm just going to refine that method, which you could also just reopen the class and redefine it. But
So it's a very structured way to create technical debt, is what you're saying.
yes, that way you can grep for refine and find them faster.
The non-obvious way to say to do, fix this later.
Yeah, because there's too many of those. So once you declare to do bankruptcy, then you move on to refine.
You move on to refinements. It sounds classier. You get to like sip some tea with your pinky up while you do it.
Yeah.
I don't have any to-dos. I have some refinements to work on.
Doing some refinements. Just working out a little kink here and there, Yeah.
I got nothing else.
Yeah.
I was wondering if they're going to go into the why, or maybe that just comes with time, like understanding when there's a use case for it. Because they're like going into more detail on specifics and what's, but not really when you would do this.
Yeah, I guess this is Ruby under a microscope, not Ruby applied. So
Good point.
Yeah, we're just looking at the internals and the parts and like examining them closely. But yeah, as far as understanding patterns and when you would use something, that's not in scope of this book, I guess. So our next book will have to do like applied Ruby patterns for everyday development or something.
Ruby you would actually use.
Yeah. Yeah.
The next chapter.
Next up, I think we're planning to do 10 and 11 together because they're both about runtime environments.
Okay.
We got JRuby, Ruby on the Java virtual machine, and then Rubinius Ruby implemented with Ruby. So if you want to keep getting meta, nothing more meta than that.
Interesting. Well, I'll try to read it more than 2 hours in advance of this meeting next time.
Nice. I won't hold you to that.
Yeah, zero promises. Maybe a 50% completion on that one.
I was in the same boat today as well.
Yeah, I was having the late morning skim.
Yeah.
Perfect.
We're all in the same boat. That's good. Yeah, it's part of book club. It's like, oh yeah, that's the time.
Yeah.
Got to read that book.
Yeah, you don't want to be the jerk that did the reading ahead of time.
No.
Maybe the next book club structure should have a pre-meeting warning, like you should probably read the chapter now.
Nice. I like that.
Come with 3 prepared points.
There's a reading day and then there's a discussion day.
That might drive the attendance to 0 though.
Yeah.
There's 2 structures.
Write a short essay about your thoughts. I'm going to skip this week.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Well, always a pleasure, everybody. And see you next week for chapters 10 and 11.
Thanks. See ya.
Yeah.
Bye.